West African people and their culture were actually somewhat civilized and lenient towards their people. They had complex rituals and ancestor worship ceremonies. They were a strong group of people based on the collective power. In West African society, the families were either patrilineal or matrilineal. It mostly depended on what your ethnic group was. Patrilineal lines passed ranks and properties through the father to the son, while matrilineal lines passed ranks and property through the females. Most families were polygynous, meaning that the male head of the family would have more than one wife. The male in these families would have multiple housing in which he would live in the main house and have his children and wives live inside the smaller housing. These houses or hamlets would be made up of lineages or extended families. These families would be made up of forced earth, mud, or mud bricks. Mostly men would dominate women as well, and women would be considered men's property. Although women were men's property, they did have lots of different rights that can leave others in awe. Women could be government officials, inherit property, own lands, control the income of lands. Also, they don't have to veil themselves in front of other men who aren't their husband or close relatives. They could have other male friends as well. Although women didn't have much as freedom compared to West African men, these women would have more freedom than most women in other areas around them. West Africans were mostly farmers, but farming in West Africa was very difficult due to how common drought was. Also, each family could only get about 2 to 3 acres of land to farm with, which was not a lot. Not only was there slavery during the Atlantic slave trade or European slavery, there was slavery even in the West African societies. Slaves could be war captives of any age or any gender. There were very unfortunate slaves who worked under overseers and gangs or large estates, and they were not as fortunate as other slaves. Some slaves who served in the royal courts of the West African kingdoms or the kingdom's armies could exercise power over free people and also could acquire property. Another thing is that slaves of peasant farmers were held up to the standards of their masters, meaning that they also had rights as well. Even though slaves were some almost treated as free beings, they still remained a very low social status throughout their generations. Art, music, and literature were a main part of West African societies. Most art and music were related to religious practices. West Africans were very good at sculpting and wood carvings. They could make sculptures out of terracotta, bronze, or brass. These sculptures were called fetishes. People would also make wooden masks, which could represent ancestral spirits or divinities. West Africans would use fetishes for many different ceremonies, such as funerals or coming-of-age ceremonies, and sometimes as well medical practices. For music, folk musicians would use many different instruments such as drums, xylophones, bells, flutes, and mbazas, which were also like banjos, to make a beat so people could dance. Dancing was very important for religious rituals. Not only did they use physical instruments to make music, such as drums or xylophones, but they also used their voices. As well in a call and response type of style of singing. In West African literature, it was mostly oral, and it was passed down from generation to generation. Lots of literature were folk tales that could help express the views of common people. Folk tales would usually tell a lesson, and they were either human. These folk stories would usually tell a lesson, and they were either human characters in it or animal characters with human characteristics. These folk tales including humans, usually dealt with human problems or scenarios such as love, creation, paths of world success, or the origin of death. The folk stories, including animal characters, were usually told to entertain or to tell a lesson. the these animals, in these stories, animals that were much smaller were put against larger animals. And these animals both would have emotion and goals, such as humans would. As you can see, art, music, literature were a big part of West African art, music, and literature were a big part of West African religion as well. In conclusion, West African culture was immensely complex and widely uninfluenced.